So I've introduced cultural landscape. Now let's see how we can read the cultural landscape. Just like we can read a text, just like we can read a book, we can find the plot, the key characters, all of that. In terms of looking at the landscape, the cultural landscape, we're going to think about all those different layers of all those different eras of humans that have occupied a particular area. And so over time they leave their imprint. And so we can then look at the landscape, we can read the landscape, and without any text, without any prompts, we can essentially start to infer. And so I'm going to teach you on how to do this. The first simple way to look at the cultural landscape is the place names, the names of places, because that has a huge role in explaining, well, who was the ones that maybe founded an area or the ones that were first to occupy an area post-Native Americans. So in the case of the United States, we see in New England, but also the northern eastern states, we're more likely to find places that are named after England. And that makes sense. And so toponyms are a very useful way to understand the cultural characteristics, especially when we think about the origins of a lot of these settlements. In the previous chapter, I looked at the different groups to settle Indiana, and the first European group to come through here were the French, and they were explorers, and so they came up the various rivers, and so as they went to different places, they then left their place names. For example, Lafayette, the city of Lafayette, which is named after a French general. The city of Vincennes, which is named for another famous French person. Terre Haute. Terre Haute does not mean armpit. Instead, it actually means high ground. And so Terre Haute means high ground. It was named after the French. We also have La Porte, which were named by those French explorers who were traveling up from the south. And they kind of cleared this area, really heavy wooded area. And so they cleared it, and so it was the door, La Porte, into the new area in which they were exploring. So we can see the early French history helping to explain a lot of these towns, which a lot of them are in the southern part of the state, which makes sense, where we have more rivers flowing, but you see a good amount there, and it's all related to settlement, but also in the case of the French exploration up the rivers. And of course, place names, we can see, the closer you get to that red line, which is the border between U.S. and Mexico, you see a lot of these place names that are of Spanish origin, whether it be San Jose, San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, New Mexico, Albuquerque, all the way down. And so that has a key role as far as explaining the culture. So just by the place names, we can see, who's the key group that either occupied this area or still does to this day. Also, when we think about place names, also the name of streets. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. streets. And so streets named after Martin Luther King Jr., obviously a prominent American, but even more so in African American society, a very, very, very key figure, very important figure. So it makes sense that 70% of the Martin Luther King Jr. streets are found somewhere in one of the southern states. There we can see in the American Southeast. But beyond, there's over about 800 different Martin Luther King streets in the country. If they're not in the American South, where they're going to be found in urban areas. And so it makes sense. We can see how certain groups who reside in an area also are then going to influence the cultural landscape, in this case the naming of streets. Now let's look at some photographs, some aerial photographs, to try to further understand and read the landscape. And we can see here Greenwood, Indiana, we see the Greenwood Park Mall, which is, first off, that huge parking lot showcases that this is very much an auto-dependent area. We can further see that with that 31, that road coming right through, diagonally through this image. We can see that's a very, very, very important transportation network, because the cluster of businesses on both sides, all throughout this image here. And so you see a lot of commercial development along there. Further, we can see beyond and the outskirts of the area, outside that 31 key road, we find residential areas, and for the most part they're very much distinctively American, suburban American, which they have these single family homes that are separate from other homes. You do see some apartments, multifamily housing, but for the most part these are separate houses, separate from each other. Further, if we go to the Greenwood Park Mall, think about what's going on inside that Greenwood Park Mall. And so if you would go there, look at the key cultural traits. You're going to see a lot of young people, a lot of shoppers, but a lot of the young people, they're not buying anything. They're just kind of walking around, checking things out, just kind of bored, just wanting to check other people out. So this is very much part of the cultural landscape when we think about Greenwood, Indiana. And here we have a home in Greenwood, so it's a very typical suburban home, which it has a large yard that surrounds it, that allows for a little bit more privacy, a little bit more separation from other homes. So you have rather large lots compared to more urban, more denser areas. So we think about the cultural landscape, and we see homes. This could be anywhere. So one part of the cultural landscape in suburban areas is the homes don't vary that much. They vary in size, but they all pretty much look the same. Not much architectural differences like you would see maybe in urban areas. Now let's contrast Greenwood to Venice, Italy. So Venice, Italy, first off, we can see here it's surrounded by nothing but water, where, of course, Greenwood, Indiana, very, very much landlocked. And to really see the density, how people are living pretty much on top of each other, you zoom in, you can really see this. And so compare Greenwood, compare that previous image of the Greenwood Park Mall. And actually what you'll find is something quite similar to what you find here in the Piazza San Marco. So if you imagine living here in Venice, imagine living in a cramped apartment where beforehand, in the previous image I showed you, you might have one family living in a big suburban home in Greenwood. Here you might have a family all packed into one small apartment. And so what happens is in the evenings as you cook the dinner, it gets really hot in those small apartments. So often what people will do, people just go walk around. And it's very ironic that you see a very similar thing you would find there back in that Greenwood Park Mall. You would see people, but now not just teenagers, just kind of walking around, bored, just trying to get out, trying to get some fresh air, trying to check out others out. Very Italian culture to kind of check people out, to stare them down, kind of creepy, but whatever. So very much part of Italian culture to do this walk, this post-dinner walk. They call it La Passeggiata. But the difference between the Greenwood Park Mall and here is this is a public space that doesn't close. It's not heavily securitized. It doesn't have security guards walking around or riding around in segways. And so here instead it's very much a public space. Where in the previous example, you see very much the same thing. People going, shopping, conglomerated area, it's privatized. So reading the cultural landscape, further the density. Just think about how high dense this area is. But key also to this is a touristy area. Greenwood Park Mall, it ain't touristy. This particular area, Venice, very romantic city, very touristy. This is the city where they have the canals as their streets. So you see a lot of gondola rides, for example. And so now here, I kind of zoom into the typical street. And so this is, apartments up above that in Venice that people live. Now compare that to, of course, suburban Greenwood. And so how people live, their way of life. We can see it in the cultural landscape. We can see how it's very much, very evident, very easy to see as we now dissect photos and go much deeper than just looking at it and say, cool, coffee shop, that's great, man.